Private László Kovács stood in line at Camp Ellis, Illinois, staring at the metal tray being loaded with food: roasted chicken, mashed potatoes swimming in gravy, fresh bread with butter, green beans, and a slice of apple pie. His hands trembled as he took the tray, certain this was some kind of trick. He had survived 2 years of war on scraps, watched friends collapse from hunger on frozen Russian roads, and now his captors were feeding him more food than he had seen in months. He didn't know that this single meal contained nearly 3,000 calories. He didn't know that every Hungarian prisoner in the camp would soon weigh more than when they were captured. He didn't know that the guilt of eating so well while his family starved back home would haunt him more than any battle. But as he sat down with that impossible feast before him, one question burned in his mind: how could the enemy treat him better than his own army ever had? Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The journey to this moment had begun in the winter of 1943, when László was conscripted into the Hungarian Second Army. He was 22 years old, a farmer's son from a small village near Debrecen, with calloused hands and a practical mind that understood crops and seasons, but nothing of geopolitics or military strategy. The recruitment officer had looked at his sturdy frame and deemed him fit for service, and within 3 weeks, László found himself on a train heading east toward the Soviet front. His mother had pressed a small photograph of the family into his hands at the station, her eyes red from crying, and his father had gripped his shoulder with the silent strength that peasant men reserve for moments when words fail them. His younger sister Anna had run alongside the train until it picked up speed, waving frantically. And that image of her small figure growing smaller stayed with him through everything that followed. The Eastern Front was a hell that no amount of training could prepare anyone for. László learned quickly that the Wehrmacht commanders viewed Hungarian troops as expendable auxiliaries, useful for holding positions that German units wouldn't waste themselves on. The cold was so severe that weapons froze, metal burned bare skin on contact, and men lost fingers and toes to frostbite before they ever saw combat. Food became an obsession, a constant gnawing presence that occupied every thought, not devoted to staying alive. The official rations were meager, often no more than a cup of watery soup and a piece of hard bread per day, sometimes even less when supply lines broke down. László watched strong men become hollow-eyed shadows, their uniforms hanging loose on frames that seemed to shrink daily. Some soldiers resorted to eating bark or searching through snow for frozen horse carcasses left behind by retreating units. László survived by a combination of luck and resourcefulness. He learned to pocket any food he came across, to trade cigarettes he didn't smoke for extra bread, to make soup from things other men wouldn't consider edible. He developed a sixth sense for which officers might have extra supplies and which moments offered opportunities to acquire them through barter or careful theft. His childhood on the farm had taught him to endure discomfort and make do with little, but even that harsh training couldn't fully prepare him for the relentless hunger that became his constant companion. At night, before sleep took him, he thought about his mother's chicken paprikash, the way she served it on Sundays with fresh egg noodles and sour cream. He thought about bread still warm from the oven, about the summer vegetables from their garden, about the simple abundance of a life where hunger was something you felt before meals, not during every waking moment. The battle that ended his war came in January of 1945, during one of the desperate last stands as Soviet forces pushed deeper into German-held territory. László's unit was ordered to defend a position near a small Ukrainian town whose name he never learned. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and half-starved, fighting an enemy that seemed to have unlimited reserves of men and ammunition. The battle lasted 3 days of chaos and terror, artillery shells turning the frozen ground into a moonscape of craters, machine gun fire cutting down anyone who moved in the open. On the 3rd day, with ammunition running low and casualties mounting, the Soviet infantry surrounded their position. László had fired his last rounds and was considering whether to die fighting or surrender when a Russian soldier appeared in his foxhole, rifle pointed at his chest. The choice was made for him. The weeks that followed as a Soviet prisoner were in some ways worse than combat. László and hundreds of other captured Hungarian soldiers were marched east in columns, guarded by Red Army soldiers who showed little mercy to stragglers. The winter was at its peak, temperatures dropping so low that men died simply by sitting down to rest. Food was scarce and irregular, usually just bread and thin soup, sometimes nothing for days. László saw men collapse and freeze to death on the roadside, their bodies left where they fell. He kept walking through sheer stubbornness, one foot in front of the other, because stopping meant death, and some irrational part of him still believed he might see his family again. At night, crammed into whatever shelter the guards could find, or simply lying in the snow, he clung to memories of home like talismans against despair. The transfer to American custody came unexpectedly in March. The Soviet Union was processing thousands of Axis prisoners and had arrangements to transfer certain groups to other Allied powers. László learned later that diplomatic considerations and logistical practicalities drove these decisions. But at the time, it simply meant being loaded onto trains heading west instead of deeper into Russia. The journey took weeks, moving through devastated landscapes where cities stood as burnt shells and refugees clogged the roads. László and his fellow prisoners barely dared to hope that conditions might improve under new captors. They had heard rumors, whispered stories about American wealth and generosity, but they had also heard horror stories about every aspect of the war, and cynicism was the armor that kept them sane. The train finally crossed into American-controlled territory in early April. László pressed his face to the gaps in the cattle car walls, watching the landscape change. The destruction here seemed less total, and occasionally he glimpsed American soldiers and vehicles. The machinery of an army that looked nothing like the desperate, depleted forces he had known. When the train finally stopped and the doors opened, he squinted against bright spring sunshine and stumbled out onto a platform where American military police waited with trucks. The MPs didn't beat them or shout, simply directed them efficiently into groups, and that basic civility felt surreal after months of brutality. Camp Ellis sat in the flat agricultural heartland of Illinois, row upon row of barracks surrounded by fences and guard towers. As the trucks rolled through the gates, László took in details with the careful attention of someone trying to assess danger. The compound looked organized, clean even, nothing like the squalid conditions he had endured. American soldiers moved with a casual confidence that spoke of good supplies and high morale. The other prisoners whispered among themselves, trying to interpret signs and make guesses about what awaited them. A man named Bela, who had been a schoolteacher before the war, pointed out the American flag and reminded everyone that they were now under the protection of the Geneva Conventions, as if that legal framework could override years of learning that promises from authorities meant nothing. The processing began immediately. American soldiers who spoke halting Hungarian explained procedures through interpreters, checked names against lists, assigned barracks numbers. László shuffled through each station, barely comprehending, until he reached the medical check. An American doctor examined him with professional thoroughness, noting his weight, checking for diseases, asking questions through an interpreter about his health history. The doctor's expression remained neutral, but László saw something flicker in his eyes, perhaps pity or concern, when measuring how thin he had become. After the examination, an orderly handed him fresh clothes, prison uniforms marked with PW on the back, and directed him to the showers. Hot water, actual hot water, poured over László's skin for the first time in longer than he could remember. He stood under the spray until a guard knocked on the stall, telling him others were waiting, and even then he moved reluctantly, savoring the simple luxury of warmth and cleanliness. That first meal came an hour later. László filed into the mess hall with 24 other new arrivals, all of them gaunt and wary, eyeing the American guards and the camp's existing prisoner population with suspicion. The serving line moved quickly, efficient as everything else in this strange place, and then he was holding that tray loaded with impossible abundance. László stared at the food, genuinely unable to process what he was seeing. The chicken was real, the potatoes were heaped in generous portions, the bread was soft and white, and that slice of pie seemed like something from a dream or a propaganda poster. Around him, other men reacted with similar disbelief. Some laughed nervously, some stood frozen, and a few began to cry quietly, overwhelmed by the sudden reversal of fortune. László carried his tray to a long table and sat down slowly, still half expecting someone to snatch the food away or reveal this as some cruel joke. He picked up the fork, cut a piece of chicken, and put it in his mouth. The taste exploded across his tongue, rich and savory and utterly real. He chewed slowly, making himself eat carefully despite the urge to devour everything instantly. His stomach had shrunk during months of near starvation, and he knew from watching others that eating too quickly after prolonged hunger could make you sick. But even eating slowly, even pacing himself, the abundance was staggering. He finished the chicken, the potatoes, the beans, soaked up gravy with the bread, and then tentatively tried the pie, the sweetness almost shocking after so long without sugar. When the meal ended, László sat back in stunned silence. His stomach felt full in a way he had almost forgotten was possible, not painfully stretched, but satisfyingly complete. Around the table, other men wore similar expressions of amazement. Bela the teacher leaned forward and said quietly that according to what he had read before the war, the Americans believed in feeding prisoners adequately as a matter of principle. That they calculated caloric needs and provided sufficient nutrition regardless of cost. Another man, a farmer named József from the same region as László, shook his head and muttered that they were eating better here than he had eaten in years, even before conscription, that his family back home would never believe this if he told them. That comment hit László like a physical blow. His family, his mother, father, little sister Anna. What were they eating tonight while he sat in American captivity with a full belly? Hungary was in chaos. Food shortages plagued even areas spared the worst fighting, and his parents were aging farmers with limited resources. The joy of the meal curdled into guilt so intense it made him nauseous. How could he sit here eating pie while his mother might be going hungry? How could he enjoy this abundance while Anna, who would be 16 now, might be facing hardships he couldn't imagine? The questions spiraled through his mind, offering no answers, only an accusatory voice that said he should refuse the food, that accepting it made him complicit in some betrayal he couldn't quite name. But when the next meal came 6 hours later, László ate again. Hunger was too recent, too visceral to refuse food on principle. Dinner brought beef stew thick with vegetables, more bread, canned peaches, and coffee with real sugar. László cleaned his plate and hated himself for it, trapped between the body's desperate need and the mind's moral calculations. That night, lying on a real bunk with clean blankets, more comfortable than he had been in 2 years, the guilt grew stronger. He could hear other men in the barracks talking quietly, processing the same contradictions. Someone mentioned that the Red Cross monitored camps and insisted on proper treatment. Another voice argued that the Americans had so much they didn't know what to do with it all, that feeding prisoners well cost them nothing. A third man said bitterly that they should enjoy it while it lasted, that nothing good ever lasted, and that tomorrow might bring new cruelties. But tomorrow brought the same routine. Breakfast was eggs, bacon, toast, and oatmeal. Lunch was sandwiches with actual meat, soup, fruit, and cookies. Dinner was pork chops with applesauce, mashed potatoes, carrots, and cake. László ate every meal, his body responding to the nutrition with visible changes. After a week, he noticed his face felt less gaunt in the mirror. After 2 weeks, his ribs became less prominent. Other prisoners showed similar transformations, color returning to complexions, energy replacing lethargy, conversations becoming more animated as physical health improved. The camp settled into rhythms. Prisoners were assigned work details, mostly maintenance and agricultural labor on the surrounding farmland. The work was nothing compared to what they had endured in the army, reasonable hours with breaks and always followed by those massive meals. László found himself on a detail tending vegetable gardens, ironic work for a farmer's son now imprisoned on foreign soil. The American guards were professional, not friendly but not cruel, treating prisoners with the impersonal efficiency of men following regulations. Some guards were young farm boys themselves, drafted for the war effort but stationed safely stateside, and occasionally László caught them looking at the Hungarian prisoners with curiosity rather than hostility. Communication between guards and prisoners remained limited by language barriers, but a few Americans spoke enough Hungarian or German to manage basic conversations. One guard named Jenkins, a lanky kid from Iowa, sometimes chatted with László during work breaks. Jenkins talked about his family's farm, about planting seasons and harvest yields, topics that transcended national boundaries. He asked László about Hungarian agriculture, about growing conditions and crops, and seemed genuinely interested in the answers. These conversations felt surreal. Enemy soldiers discussing farming techniques while the war continued somewhere across the ocean, but they also offered a strange comfort, a reminder that beneath the uniforms were just people who happened to be born in different places. Letters became László's obsession. The camp allowed prisoners to write home, though mail service was irregular and censored. László labored over letters to his family, trying to convey that he was alive and safe without admitting how well fed he was. How could he tell his mother about 3 meals a day totaling 3,000 calories when she might be rationing bread? How could he describe butter and meat and desserts when his sister might be going without necessities? He wrote careful letters that emphasized his safety and health without details, that asked anxiously about their well-being, that begged for responses, even though he knew mail from war-torn Hungary might never arrive. Weeks passed with no replies, the silence feeding his worry until it became a constant ache beneath the routine of camp life. Other prisoners struggled with similar conflicts. Conversations in the barracks often turned to families back home, men sharing memories and worries in the dark. Béla the teacher spoke of his wife and young daughter in Budapest, wondering if they had survived the bombing raids. József the farmer worried about his elderly parents managing the farm alone. A young soldier named András, barely 19, cried sometimes at night for his mother, quiet sobs he thought no one heard, but that carried in the darkness. The American abundance surrounded them with physical comfort, while psychological torment grew from not knowing whether their loved ones lived or died. Spring turned to summer. The vegetable gardens László tended flourished under his practiced care, and he found grim humor in growing food for his captors with skills learned from the father he might never see again. The American Midwest revealed itself as remarkably similar to the Hungarian plains, flat agricultural land stretching to distant horizons, the same kinds of crops and concerns about weather and soil. Local farmers sometimes drove past the camp, their trucks loaded with produce, and László wondered what they thought about enemy soldiers imprisoned in their peaceful countryside, whether they felt fear or curiosity or indifference. In July, the camp held a celebration for American Independence Day. The prisoners watched from their compound as guards and staff gathered for festivities, music drifting over the fences, the smell of grilling meat making mouths water, even though prisoners had just finished their own substantial lunch. Later, someone distributed ice cream to the prisoners, an extravagance so unexpected that grown men laughed with childlike delight. László ate his ice cream slowly, savoring the cold sweetness, thinking about the last time he had tasted ice cream, a summer fair before the war, Anna getting it all over her face and laughing. The memory brought tears he quickly wiped away, not wanting others to see his weakness. The guilt never disappeared, but László learned to carry it. He ate the meals because refusing them served no purpose, because his body needed repair after years of deprivation, because his family would want him to survive and come home healthy. He worked the garden detail because idleness bred despair. He wrote letters because hope required action even when outcomes seemed impossible. He talked with other prisoners because shared suffering needed shared processing. Life in the camp became a strange limbo. Comfortable captivity that felt more secure than freedom had felt in years, yet poisoned by uncertainty about the future and the past. Mail finally arrived in August. László's hands shook as the camp clerk handed him an envelope, his mother's handwriting on the outside somehow miraculous after months of silence. He sat on his bunk and carefully opened it, smoothing the pages, reading words that had traveled impossible distances to reach him. His mother wrote that she had received his letters, that the whole family wept with relief knowing he lived. She wrote that conditions at home were difficult, but they were managing, that his father still worked the farm, though age made it harder, that Anna helped with everything and had grown into a capable young woman. She wrote that they thanked God daily for his safety and begged him to stay strong and come home when the war ended. She mentioned food only once, saying they had enough, but László could read between the lines. They were hungry, Not starving perhaps, but going without, rationing carefully, making do with less while he sat in Illinois eating 3,000 calories a day. The letter should have brought comfort, but instead intensified his torment. Knowing they lived brought overwhelming relief, but knowing they struggled while he ate well brought overwhelming guilt. László read the letter dozens of times, memorizing every word, trying to extract meaning from what his mother didn't say. Other prisoners who received mail had similar reactions, joy and pain mixing into complicated emotional storms. Those who received no mail sank into darker places, imagination filling silence with worst-case scenarios. Summer faded into autumn. The war in Europe ended in May, but prisoners in American camps remained detained while authorities sorted through millions of displaced persons and decided what to do with former enemy combatants. News filtered into the camp through guards and occasionally through newspapers that prisoners were allowed to see. Germany had surrendered, the nightmare was over, but Hungary's fate remained unclear. Soviet forces occupied the country, a new order was being imposed, and repatriation for Hungarian prisoners became tangled in Cold War politics that were already beginning even before the hot war fully ended. László and his fellow prisoners found themselves in a strange position. They wanted to go home desperately, yet they also feared what home had become under Soviet occupation. Stories circulated about arrests and purges, about the communist government viewing returning soldiers with suspicion, about former POWs being sent to labor camps for having been captured rather than fighting to the death. The uncertainty was maddening. American captivity provided safety and sustenance, but kept them trapped in limbo, unable to return to families who needed them, unable to rebuild lives shattered by war. The autumn harvest brought abundant produce from the gardens László had helped tend. The irony wasn't lost on him that he had spent the growing season cultivating food in a prison camp, while his father struggled to maintain their family farm without help. The vegetables went into camp kitchens, appearing in the endless succession of generous meals that continued to astonish prisoners even after months of receiving them. László's body had recovered fully, weight restored, strength returned, health better than before conscription. He looked in mirrors and saw a healthy man, well-fed and cared for, and felt like a ghost haunting someone else's body. Winter came again, László's second winter away from home, his first winter comfortable and safe. Snow fell on the Illinois plains, covering the landscape in white that looked like Hungary but wasn't, familiar and foreign at once. The camp's heating system worked efficiently, barracks stayed warm, meals remained abundant even as temperatures dropped. László thought about the previous winter, about frozen Russian roads and men dying in the cold, and couldn't reconcile that memory with his current reality. Survival had required becoming someone harder, someone capable of enduring anything, but now that hardness seemed unnecessary, the armor he had built to protect himself becoming a cage that isolated him from comfort he didn't feel he deserved. Christmas brought decorations and special meals, ham and turkey and pies, American generosity extending even to prisoners. A local church group visited, singing carols and distributing small gifts, their faces earnest with goodwill that felt bizarre to László. These people's country had been at war with his country, yet here they stood offering charity and kindness, unable to see enemy soldiers as enemies because perhaps they never truly hated the way soldiers at the front learned to hate. László accepted a scarf and a book, thanked them in broken English, and wondered what Anna would think of Americans giving Christmas gifts to her imprisoned brother while she went without. Letters continued to arrive sporadically. His mother's subsequent notes maintained the careful optimism of the first, asking about his health, assuring him of their love, avoiding details about hardships. László read between the lines and understood that things were worse than she admitted. He wrote back equally careful letters, describing camp life in vague terms, emphasizing his eagerness to return home, avoiding any mention of the abundance that surrounded him. The lies by omission felt necessary, protecting his family from knowledge that would only cause them pain without benefiting anyone. As 1946 arrived, talk of repatriation intensified. American authorities began processing Hungarian prisoners for return transport, coordinating with Soviet-occupied Hungary's government. The prospect brought equal measures of hope and fear. László wanted desperately to see his family, to hold his mother and confirm with his own eyes that they survived, to help his aging father with farm work, to meet the young woman his sister had become. But he also feared what awaited in Soviet-occupied Hungary, feared arrest, feared persecution, feared discovering that survival had only delivered him to a new kind of captivity. The day his name appeared on the repatriation list, László felt his stomach drop. Other men celebrated, eager to leave despite the risks, but László found himself paralyzed by contradictory emotions. He sought out Jenkins the guard, who had become as close to a friend as circumstances allowed, and tried to explain through inadequate language the confusion he felt. Jenkins listened patiently, then said something László understood. Home is home. Simple words, but they carried weight. Whatever waited in Hungary, whatever risks and hardships, it was home, and home was worth the danger. The transport left in February. László and several hundred other Hungarian prisoners boarded trains, retracing journeys made years earlier under very different circumstances. The American guards who saw them off were professional to the end, efficient and impersonal, though Jenkins shook László's hand and wished him luck. The train pulled away from Camp Ellis, leaving behind the strange interlude of comfortable captivity, moving toward futures no one could predict. The journey took weeks, moving through Europe still scarred by war, past destroyed cities and displaced populations, through zones of occupation where different Allied powers controlled different sectors. László watched the landscape change, recognition growing as they moved east, until finally the train crossed into Hungarian territory and he saw places he knew, villages and towns that looked damaged but recognizable. His heart raced, anticipation and fear mixing until he felt physically sick. The Soviet authorities who took custody of the returning prisoners were as coldly efficient as the Americans had been warm and generous. Processing took days of interrogation, officials demanding to know details about capture and imprisonment, suspicious of anyone who had survived capture rather than dying heroically. László answered carefully, downplaying the American treatment, emphasizing his desire to return to productive work. Some returning prisoners were arrested immediately, taken away to fates unknown, accused of collaboration or cowardice or whatever charges Soviet paranoia invented. László made it through screening, released with papers that allowed him to travel home, but marked him as a former POW, a designation that would shadow him for years. The final leg of his journey was made by train and foot, traveling toward his village with growing urgency. The countryside looked poorer than he remembered, fields showing signs of neglect, people looking worn and hungry. Hungary had paid terrible prices for its role in the war, and recovery would take generations. László thought about the meals at Camp Ellis, about 3,000 calories a day, about the waste that got thrown away after every meal, and felt sick with the comparison to the poverty he saw around him. His village appeared in the distance, smaller than memory suggested but unmistakable. László's pace increased to a near run, pack bouncing on his back, breathing hard not from exertion but from emotion threatening to overwhelm him. He turned down the familiar road leading to his family's farm, seeing the house that had filled his dreams for 2 years. And then the door opened and his mother stood there, older and thinner but alive, and her scream brought his father and Anna running, and then they were all crying and holding each other. And László was home. The initial joy of reunion gave way to the harder work of rebuilding lives. László discovered that his mother's careful letters had hidden serious deprivation. The farm had barely produced enough to keep them fed, Soviet requisitions taking much of what they grew, black market prices consuming what little money they had. They had been hungry, truly hungry, rationing carefully and going without to survive. Anna had left school to work, his father's health had declined, and the whole family bore marks of hardship that László's American-fed body made obscene by contrast. He tried to help, throwing himself into farm work with restored strength, but found the 2 years away had created gaps in knowledge and experience. His father had aged in ways that went beyond mere time, the war taking some essential vitality and leaving behind a man who moved more slowly and spoke more quietly. Anna had become a serious young woman, her her childhood stolen by necessity, capable and competent but with sadness in her eyes that hadn't been there before. His mother held him as if afraid he might disappear, and sometimes at night he heard her crying quietly, releasing emotions held back during years of not knowing if her son lived. László never told them about the food at Camp Ellis. How could he? What purpose would it serve to describe 3,000-calorie meals to people who had starved in his absence? He mentioned that American camps provided adequate rations, enough to keep prisoners healthy, but avoided details that would have seemed like fantasy or torture. When his mother asked if he had suffered, László talked about the cold Russian winter and the fear of battle, traumas she could understand, and omitted the guilt of comfortable captivity that remained his private burden. The farm needed everything: new equipment, better seeds, repairs to buildings, things that required money they didn't have. László worked sunrise to sunset, trying to make up for lost time, trying to justify the strength his American captors had given him by feeding him so well. He volunteered for the hardest tasks, pushed himself to exhaustion, drove himself with an intensity that worried his family. His mother asked him to rest, to recover from his ordeal, not understanding that work was how he dealt with guilt that had no other outlet. Gradually, the farm stabilized. László's labor made a difference, his restored health allowing him to do work his aging father could no longer manage. They produced enough to meet Soviet quotas and have some left over, enough that meals became regular if not generous, enough that the constant gnawing hunger eased. László watched his family regain weight and energy, saw color return to his mother's face and strength return to his father's step, and finally began to feel that perhaps he had earned the survival his captors had given him. Years passed. Hungary remained under Soviet control, but life found rhythms. László married a woman from a neighboring farm, had children, continued working the land his family had worked for generations. He rarely spoke about the war, and never about Camp Ellis, keeping those memories locked away like contraband that might cause trouble if discovered. The guilt faded into background noise, present but manageable, a permanent companion that no longer paralyzed him. Sometimes, usually in spring when the fields were green and abundant, László thought about that first meal at Camp Ellis, about the impossible feast that had seemed like a trick or a dream. He thought about Jenkins, the Iowa farm boy guard, about Bela the teacher, and Yosef the farmer, and Andras the crying boy, scattered now across Hungary, rebuilding shattered lives. He thought about the strange mercy of comfortable captivity, about enemies who had fed him better than his own army or his own country could manage, about the contradictions and complexities that made simple judgments impossible. László never spoke about these thoughts, but they shaped how he lived. He taught his children to value food, to never waste, to share with those who had less. He helped neighbors when harvests failed, remembering what it felt like to be hungry and grateful for abundance. He looked at his own country's poverty and the wealth he had glimpsed in American captivity and wondered what different choices might have made different outcomes, questions with no answers but worth asking nonetheless. The Soviet system eventually loosened its grip on Hungary, though the process took decades of gradual change and occasional upheaval. László watched the 1956 revolution from his farm, too old now to fight but young enough to remember what fighting cost. He saw Soviet tanks roll through Budapest on newsreels and felt the old fear return, the memory of powerlessness in the face of overwhelming force. Young people died in the streets demanding freedom, and László grieved for them while recognizing the courage he had never possessed, having survived through adaptation rather than resistance. His children grew up in a different world than the one he had known, educated in state schools that taught approved versions of history where László's service in the wartime Hungarian army was something shameful to be hidden rather than acknowledged. He let them believe what they needed to believe, understanding that each generation fought different battles. His daughter became a teacher, his son an engineer, both of them moving to Budapest for opportunities the village couldn't provide. László remained on the farm with his wife, working the land until his body forced retirement, watching seasons turn and crops grow in cycles that connected him to something older and more permanent than political systems. In the 1980s, as communist control weakened further, László began speaking more openly about his war experiences. His grandchildren, curious about family history, asked questions that their parents had learned not to ask, and László found himself telling stories he had kept silent for 40 years. He described the Eastern Front's bitter cold, the chaos of capture, the unexpected mercy of American captivity. His grandchildren listened with the fascination of those who had never known hunger or war, for whom history was abstract rather than lived experience. When he mentioned the food at Camp Ellis, the 3,000 calories daily, the meat and desserts and abundance, they struggled to understand why this mattered so profoundly. They had grown up with adequate food, couldn't grasp what prolonged hunger felt like or how deeply it marked those who experienced it. László tried to explain that the American generosity had taught him something essential about human nature, that people could be kind even to enemies, that prosperity created capacity for mercy that desperation destroyed. His grandchildren nodded politely, but he could see they didn't fully comprehend. How could they? They had never been so hungry that food became an obsession, never experienced the guilt of eating well while loved ones starved, never faced the moral complexity of being treated better by captors than by commanders. These were lessons learned through suffering, and László was grateful his grandchildren would never understand them through experience, even as he wished they could grasp them through imagination. The Berlin Wall fell in 1989, and Hungary transformed again, communist system collapsing with surprising speed. László was in his 60s now, old enough to have lived through multiple regimes, each claiming to represent ultimate truth and permanent order. He had learned not to trust such claims, having seen too many certainties dissolve into chaos. The farm remained constant through political upheaval, land outlasting governments, seasons more reliable than ideologies. In the end, László Kovács lived a long life, becoming a grandfather and then a great-grandfather, watching Hungary slowly recover and eventually transform. The war became history, immediate trauma fading into collected memory, individual suffering absorbed into national narrative. But some nights, especially in winter when snow covered the fields, László lay awake and remembered being 23 years old, standing in a mess hall in Illinois, holding a tray loaded with impossible abundance, learning that even in war, even in captivity, human capacity for mercy could exceed all reasonable expectation. That knowledge, both comforting and disturbing, stayed with him until the end, a gift from enemies who had fed him when his own allies would have let him starve, a paradox that defined his understanding of a world more complicated than simple divisions of good and evil could ever capture.